There is more evidence, more and more, that our relationships with one another are one of the most significant factors in our physical, mental, and emotional health and happiness. Research is indicating that our relationships are as important to our well-being as nutrition and physical fitness. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is the longest-running study of human happiness, found that strong social connections are the single best predictor of a long, healthy, satisfying life. And you may be wondering what all this has to do with Easter. So please be patient. I will finally get around to making the connection. But let's start with today's gospel, John's story of the resurrection. It is different from the resurrection accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it does have one thing in common with them: Mary Magdalene. She is the only person who appears in all four Gospels as a witness to the resurrection. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, she is always with other women. That fact in itself is remarkable, because if the authors of the Gospels had wanted to manipulate people into believing in the resurrection, they would have made men the witnesses. Instead, all four authors fearlessly report that women who were not viewed in those days as credible witnesses of any kind were the first to announce that Jesus had risen from the dead. And of course, there is the Mary Magdalene issue. For several hundred years after the first century, she was actually praised as the apostle to the apostles. Tradition portrayed her as the disciple who understood Jesus better than any of the others. There were stories told about how she would often explain Jesus' intent and teachings to the other disciples. But then, in 591, along came Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, who announced in his Easter sermon that year that Mary was a prostitute. There is nothing in Scripture that supports that belief. But unfortunately, that sermon has colored our perceptions of Mary Magdalene to this day. Way back in 1969, Pope Paul VI proclaimed that she was no longer to be viewed as a, quote, sinful woman. Her rehabilitation began, but honestly, it has been a tough road. Negative portrayals persist. And in today's gospel, Mary is distraught, weeping, grieving the loss of her teacher. When she assumes that someone has stolen Jesus' body, she runs to Peter and the unnamed beloved disciple and reports the news. Then they all run back to the tomb and see that the linen wrappings for Jesus' body are still there. They don't seem to understand the implication of this fact. A grave robber would not stop to unwrap a body. The fourth evangelist, John, tells us that indeed the disciples do not understand the scripture that indicates Jesus will rise from the dead. And finally, anticlimactically, Peter and the beloved apostle return home without a clue about what has just happened. And the scene shifts back to Mary, crying as she looks into the tomb and sees what the men have not seen: the two angels. They are not messengers of the resurrection, as in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but here they are signifying the new reality that Jesus has defeated death. When Mary turns away from the tomb, she doesn't recognize Jesus standing before her. And I always imagined that the rising sun was behind him in the east, and his features were obscured by the blinding light behind him. And he asks her, "What are you looking for?" And like the angels, inquires why she is crying. And she thinks he's a gardener. And ironically, he is the gardener of Eden, the firstborn of creation. In desperation, she pleads with him, hoping that if he has carried the body away, he will at least tell her where Jesus is. And again, ironically, he has taken the body, his own body, resurrected. Then, with what must have been profound compassion and endearment, Jesus says her name, Mary. She recognizes him immediately and calls him Rabboni, a term of intimacy, a term that illustrates their close relationship. Their recognition of each other echoes Jesus' famous, beloved teaching in John's Gospel. I am the good shepherd. I call my sheep by name, and they know my voice. I know mine, and mine know me. And then Jesus gives his first post-resurrection commandment. He tells Mary not to touch him, not to try to hold on to him. She isn't necessarily touching him. It's more likely he perceives that she is about to do that, though. And what he says to her seems a bit off-putting to us because we know that in next week's gospel, he will invite Thomas to do just that, to touch him. What follows after this in the gospel is a theological discussion for which I needed some help from some Bible scholars in order to understand. And I will do my best to explain what I learned. It's complicated, though. First, what we need to remember is the beginning of John's gospel, the very beginning, the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Of course, Christ, the second person of the Trinity, is the Word. And in John's gospel, Christ has always existed. Bible scholars believe that when Jesus tells Mary not to hold on to him, it is because he needs to continue to move on. The events of what he has called his hour, that is his death, resurrection, and ascension, are still unfolding. They are in progress and must not be stopped. He seems to have places to go that day and people to see. Gail O'Day, who is a brilliant Bible commentator, argues that what John has written here in verses 17 and 18 is confusing to us because it arises from the awkwardness of John having to give us a narrative of the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension that conforms to our perception of how time works. In other words, time works for us as one thing happens after another. But John, in his writing, somehow realizes in a way that's impossible for him and us to understand that these events of crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension transcend and transform time as we know it. So John is trying to do his best here to communicate his limited understanding that these are what are called trans-temporal events. Trans-temporal, beyond time, even though for him and for us, we see them as distinct events, the death, resurrection, and ascension. But for God and Christ, those events are trans-temporal, outside of time, because God is outside of time. It is almost as if John is trying to explain quantum physics 2,000 years ago. Notice that in talking with Mary, Jesus tells her to proclaim the final event, the ascension to my brothers, not to proclaim the resurrection as we would expect. By the way, the Greek word translated brothers there actually means siblings, women as well as men. And then comes the zinger, the really important part of this gospel. Jesus lets her know that returning to the Father at the ascension will make it possible for her, the disciples, and us to share truly in his relationship with God. He says to her that he will return to my Father and your Father, my God and your God. I have heard, read, marked, learned, and inwardly digested this gospel so many times. I have preached on it so many Easters, but I've always given verses 17 and 18 just a passing glance. And this week, I finally saw how liberating, how awesome these words are. So now, I'm back to talking about relationship, about the relationship to God that Jesus has promised Mary Magdalene. In John's Gospel, Jesus never tells her, we've got to believe this and that and this. All he tells us is to abide with him and love one another. And over throughout John's Gospel, Jesus says, have a relationship with me. I have a relationship with the Father, and if you have a relationship with me, you also have a relationship with the Father. It's why Christ, the second person of the Trinity, came to us. He took on a human nature so that it would be easier for us to have a relationship with God, a relationship that will last beyond our earthly lives. But Christ came as Jesus, asking us to abide with him, and promised that through him we would be able to abide with God in relationship. His death, resurrection, and ascension made this possible. And yes, having relationships is a significant factor in our physical, mental, and emotional health and happiness. But none of these relationships is as life-sustaining as the relationship we can have with Christ. We still need to do the good work of developing solid relationships with one another. We need to focus on the quality of those connections bonded by trust, respect, and open communication. And we need to build a network of support with family, friends, people we work with, people at school, people at church. Our bonds with those people prepare us to build that trusting, loving relationship with Christ in whatever way works for every one of us. Melody Rose, who's talking to me right now, Melody Rose has relationships already to her parents, her grandparents, other relatives, and their friends. So I think it's time for us to help her along as she grows in these relationships. So let's get her baptized. Amen.